My name is Cornelia Göls. I'm a PhD student at the doctoral program, the Austrian Galicia and its multicultural heritage. On behalf of the organizing team, I want to thank the doctoral program Galicia as well as the Institute of Political Science for their support and thus making this evening possible. And I want to thank the other members of the organizing team, namely Matthias Kaltenbrunner and especially Tobias Spöri and Felix Jeitner, who did the bulk of the work. And last but not least, of course, special thanks are due to our panelists, who will be introduced later than by Felix. Our motivation for organizing this event was to gain a better understanding of the Maidan protests by directly speaking and asking some activists and going beyond the media coverage in Austria, which we often perceived as too simplifying and neglecting the heterogenic and dynamic character of the phenomenon and not really being able to explain why let's say, rather bureaucratic act as the non-signing of the association agreement with the European Union could lead to such dramatic events. As an introduction to our topic, I want to give a short and very superficial overview of the most important dates, respectively phases of the Maidan protests, since they ended already almost a year ago. Tomorrow, unfortunately, is the sad anniversary of the first dead Maidan protester, and were followed by dramatic events such as the annexation of Crimea or the battles in Donbass, which drew the attention away from Maidan. Yes, as you all remember, the protest started on November the 23rd in the year 2013 on Maidan Niezależności. In this phase, it were peaceful protests, mainly of students for European integration, because the government refused to sign the EU association agreement. 3 days later, massive demonstrations took place, the largest then since the Orange Revolution. And soon, the protest grows not only in Kyiv but other cities too. Then, during the night from 29th to 30th November, the special police force Berkut brutally attacks and seriously injures many of the peaceful protesters. So violence started, and mass protests against the Yanukovych government were the answer. At the end of December, the first rally of Autumn Maidan takes place, and the administration tried to end protests by using violence and arresting activists. As a kind of result of this, during January 2014, the protests radicalized and more gained the character of an uprising. Persecution of the protesters expanded. There were cases of severe torture, and on January 16th, the so-called dictatorship laws passed through the parliament. As a reaction, the Maidan protests escalates, especially in Olszewski Street towards Parliament, and on January the 21st and 22nd, the first death occurs because of sniper fire. Then the clashes between police forces and protesters steadily increased. In February, then the streets fighting escalates, and snipers repeatedly shoot at protesters. More than 80 people were killed. The right sector called to arms for militant self-defense against the police. But also anti-Maidan gatherings take place. Then the last stations were negotiations between opposition parties and government and EU foreign ministers. and they agreed on a peace agreement, including new presidential elections and the restitution of the 2004 constitution. But at the presentation to the public on the Maidan, Klitschko was booed and called a traitor. The Maidan didn't accept this agreement, and during the night Yanukovych left Kyiv for eastern Ukraine, and the new government then set presidential elections for May, and the so-called Maidan Council agrees to name Yatsenyuk as interim prime minister. On February the 27th, the interim cabinet was confirmed by parliament, which generally speaking marked the end of the Maidan demonstration. So much for the chronology, but now we want to learn about the experiences and opinions of the activists. So let's fulfill our promise and start to talk to them. For this purpose, I give the floor to our moderator, Felix Jaikner, and thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Cornelia, for the interesting introduction. I would also like to welcome everyone here warmly to our discussion today. I think the protest on the Maidan showed or represented probably the beginning of a new era for the Ukraine, because we saw, as Cornelia already explained before, a wave of self-organized networks and grassroots initiatives that emerged and shaped now or are still shaping actually the political and social landscape in the country. On the other hand, we see the formation of a new government and the split of the political and economic elite in the Ukraine, which also influences the future development of the state. And of course, right now the country is in a state of open warfare, which in the eastern Ukraine, which influences the discussions and the debate on the Maidan very severely, and we think therefore it's very important to reflect upon the Maidan, to reflect upon the developments that took place, and also on the demands that were formulated during this time. And therefore I think that we thought that the discussion is a good chance to get to know the events, and I'm very gladful that we have the chance to speak to two activists who are from the Ukraine, who were present at the protest, and one scientist also from the Ukraine who has followed the events very closely. I would like to introduce Maria TOMAK on the far left. She works for the Center for Civil Liberties and was active in the Maidan movement from the very beginning, taking part in a self-organized network, the SOS Maidan movement, and is up till now, she documents human rights violations in the eastern Ukraine. To my left is Maksym BUTKEVYCH. He is a member of the No Borders movement, and he and his colleagues are involved in providing legal assistance and forms of social aid to asylum seekers in the Ukraine, and also to internally displaced persons in the Ukraine, which is probably now a very acute topic due to the Crimea issue and also the conflict, the war in the eastern Ukraine. Moreover, he was active also from the almost beginning in the Maidan, and also set up a self-organized initiative there. And to my right side, Tatiana Burzhenko. She studied political economy and philosophy at Kharkiv State University, where she later on worked also. Now she is director of research for the Russia and Global Dialogue topic, or research focus at the Institute for Human Science in Vienna. Her research focuses are the construction of identity and memory politics in post-Soviet space, and moreover she focuses on gender issues. My name is Felix Jaikner. I'm a doctoral student here at the university. My focus is mostly Russia and natural resource development in Russia, and I'm going to moderate the discussion. My first question would address Maria. I think probably one of the key issues here is that in Austria, the protests were perceived usually as pro-European and anti-Russian protests. And I would like you to elaborate a little bit more on that. Why did people actually start to protest, and how did the protest develop over the future months? And probably also, if you could add your perspective on it, why did you get involved, and what was maybe the trigger for you to get active on the Maidan movement?
Thank you. Hi everyone. Thank you for your interest to Ukraine and to Maidan, which is very important, I think, for EU also and for the whole Europe. I just start with the fact that actually my first revolutionary experience was in 2004 during the Orange Revolution. I was 17 and I was very inspired, by these events because it was non-violent revolution. Lots of people were disappointed later with the political developments of that event, but still I was not, because my motivation was not in Yushchenko become president, but in some fighting for democratic values, all that kind of stuff. I was a big supporter, and I am a big supporter of Ukrainian-European integration. And when Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine refused from implementing the program which should prepare Ukraine to the signing of association agreement, I had no doubts if should I go to the to Maidan or not. I went there on the same evening when lots of people did, not so much, but still. I just have to argue that it was like I perceived it as a pro-European revolution, but not anti-Russian. It was at all not anti-Russian. It was anti-authoritarian and anti-Soviet, because we still have lots of things in our society. I think same as lots of societies on the post-Soviet space, which we can call like a Soviet mentality or something, which is very much criticized. So for me it was something like this. I could not imagine even that after that we will have these events, I mean the war and the annexation of Crimea. It is interesting that, I mean, if you look on the sociology, a few months before Maidan, you cannot see any signs that people will go to the streets because of not signing the association agreement. There were some moods, some protest moods, but they were connected first of all with like issues like salary and these kind of things. Very, very rational, but not like ideological or political in a broad sense, wide sense. That's why for me it was a surprise, taking into account that before, I think 1 week before, we made, with our colleagues, we made also a protest near the committees of the parliament, and we also demanded like to force the process of adoption of Ukrainian legal system to the requirements of EU, and there were about 10 protesters, and I was very disappointed, and I wrote to my Facebook like, guys, hello, it's not normal, and I was sure that people will not, I mean, I couldn't even think about it. But then it appeared to be that lots of people support. I think that firstly they wanted to get rid of this Soviet, post-Soviet mentality, and for them, Europe and EU seem to be like an alternative. And of course, it was not about some bureaucratic procedure, which was mentioned here by your colleague. It was not about it.
Yeah.
Lots of people did not read the association agreement at all, because it's kind of lots of pages. It was about some values which in the imagination of Ukrainian society are connected to the EU, like rule of law, like normal law enforcement system, like freedom of speech, and of course wealthy society. Of course, it is one of the points, main points, but still it's not the single one. I will be brief, sorry. I just want to say that, of course, there were different stages of that protest, beginning with the completely peaceful, and then the violence began. I was involved in that Euromaidan SOS initiative. We tried to help people with different kind of aid, legal aid, and we were looking for the missing people. But on some moment we realized that it is a struggle. It's like kind of real war, because people were disappearing, people were getting detained, people were beaten and injured. And in January, Berkut began to shoot in the eyes of journalists, for example, who made the shootings on, who were working in the field. That's why, firstly, of course, my attitude towards the escalation was very negative. I was trying to find an explanation in some kind of provocations and so on. But then I realized that I have no moral right now to judge these people, and we were trying to help those people who were detained, who were injured by the law enforcement. And very interesting moment about how did it all ended. How Maidan ended. And why Yanukovych fled, actually. It's interesting because, as you know, as it already have been said, that after the mass killings on 20th of February, when dozens of people were killed, Yanukovych were not afraid about that. I suppose he was sure that he will be safe. But he fled because the heads of the law enforcement system suddenly disappeared, and after that, simple police workers and internals, or called internal troops, also began to run away from Kyiv and from Ukraine. And that's why it just was published a few weeks ago in the New York Times, a kind of investigation. You can look into it. And actually Maidan ended, but Maidan ended with Yanukovych escape, but Maidan ended also with the beginning of Russian aggression against Ukraine. So that's be my short answer.
Thank you very much, Maria, for the interesting description of the development. Maksym, I would like to focus maybe with my next question a little bit more on the structure of the protest and the self-organized initiatives that arose during the protest. What would you say, in what respect did they actually sufficiently work? And how were they formed? And maybe with regard to something like what Maria said as anti-Soviet protest and anti-authoritarian to what extent did they actually attract people from other post-Soviet countries? If you could elaborate on that.
Okay. I can try, because of course the structure of Maidan was not the same over the months. And I was at Maidan from 30th of November, after the crackdown of riot police on the students' protest, on the first one. Basically, the first week, a bit more than that, of Euromaidan protest was about association agreement, really. And many people I know hesitated to take part in that, not because they loved Yanukovych regime, but because they were aware that association agreement consisted both political and economic part. And economic part was something extremely dodgy, as you can imagine. But really, by that time, Ukrainian society, majority of it, had idea of association with the EU, not expecting paradise in the nearest months or so, but having this idea of, as Maria said, clear rules of the game, rule of law, and end to corruption being part of the package. They were tired of arbitrariness of Yanukovych family, which became a ruling clan. Family meaning family. His son became the richest man in Ukraine just in a few years' time. So they expected that the EU will push Ukraine towards more clear rules of the game, at least for investors' sake, if not for any other reasons. And actually, as we worked with Ukrainian legislation before, we saw that some laws which were necessary, like anti-discrimination legislation, were adopted only as a part of preparation for association agreement. This is why it was perceived as in a positive light. But not that many people actually came out to the streets because of the association agreement rejection, not as many as later, and this is why the structures were different. First part of Maidan, which was about Europe mostly, this first week, very quickly split in two parts. One was non-party protesters, mostly students and young non-party activists, and another one was called Party Maidan, where oppositional parties were or tried to be the core of the protest, and which was not that popular. Also because these oppositional parties had different agendas. I would disagree on one maybe small definition with Maria. It was not anti-Russian, but it was definitely anti-Putin's Russia. Yanukovych somehow walked into his own trap, because his government for 1.5 years made advertisement campaign for Ukrainian population why we should sign association agreement. And then last week, before the signing ceremony, he was basically forced to go to Moscow and to meet Putin. And it was quite clear that he had some offers and some demands from Putin, which pushed him to reject the agreement. So it was quite clear that Putin wants to keep Yanukovych far from the EU, meaning close to Moscow. But this was somehow exploited by some far-right groups as well, which became part of the both non-party Maidan and party Maidan. Then they united together, then politicians left, and on that night there was this heavy crackdown against what remained of the protest by that time. And this crackdown started the totally different stage of Maidan, when hundreds of thousands of people poured onto the streets next morning, being furious not only and not in the first place due to association agreement, but due to police violence and the fact of open neglect of citizens' rights to protest and to say what people had to say, especially if these people were young students. I think partly these protests were also fueled by very cynical explanation which was provided by Kyiv police, that they had to use force against students, which meant to heavily injure dozens of people, because they needed to install Christmas tree in the center of Kyiv on that very spot where the protest took place. So this is why they've badly beaten so many people. And this really provoked a lot of people to turn protesters, and they self-organized the basic structure very quickly. When on the 30th of November I arrived to Mikhailivska Square, one of the central squares, all infrastructure was already in place, the basic one. Hot tea was there, warm gloves and socks were here, info point was here, first units of self-defense started to be formed. It was all done by people who arrived. Gloves and socks were just brought by anyone who went there. They just bought them on their way to the protest. And it was only in the evening when professional politicians arrived. They came and they saw that everything is done already. The protest is up and running. They went to this stage and said, "Hello, we are Committee of National Salvation." And everyone was like, "Really?" And next day, this much bigger crowd of people took over Maidan Nezalezhnosti, the central square of Kyiv, and organized the stable protest. But the core elements were the same, and they were self-organized. So basically, it was an organization bottom up. There was no person who came around saying, "I'm your leader, and you will do this." Self-defense units were obviously needed first for protection of the place of the protest from riot police. By that time, no one even could imagine that within a month and a half we'll have to deal with gangs of plainclothes thugs, basically death squadrons who would kidnap people and torture them to death. So at the beginning it was only about protection from police and also to stop someone who would provoke protesters to use violence. Self-defense was actually not violent, but first an anti-violent force. And very soon it was coordinated by Andrei Parubin, a politician with a far-right background in his youth, what made a lot of people nervous. But the very first thing which was proclaimed, that self-defense is out of party politics, and no person taking part in it can propagate any political party allegiance and any specific ideology, and better not to belong to any party, actually. And this is how self-defense stayed throughout the whole Maidan. Then the structure became really more and more sophisticated because it was a network. When the need of warm clothes or food or wood or anything else appeared, there was just a call for people to bring it, and people started to bring it. I mean, it sounds very theoretically, but to me the closest example, apart from me and my family, are my parents. My mom just cooked soup and brought it. And this is what thousands of people did more or less every day. This is how it worked. This time, Facebook really played a huge role. I mean, we've all heard about these Facebook revolutions and Twitter revolutions, and it became, like, in the context of Arab Spring, it became some trivia. But for the first time, I've seen how it works. When there was the first attempt to disperse Maidan by riot police between 10th and 11th of December, it was straight away on the Facebook, and it was about 1 a.m., 2 a.m. when it started. Like, guys, we need people here. And from all over Kyiv, and Kyiv is quite big on Ukrainian standards, people started to go, to call taxis, to drive cars. They started to exchange messages on Facebook. I have a car, I'm on the left bank of the river. I have 2 spare seats. If anyone needs to be there, I can pick you up. I mean, these people were total strangers. And this was a usual thing. Those who helped people to climb, they started to form groups, like friends of mine. They joined some other cars, bringing injured people out. for those who were tired and freezing. And this is how these things were done, and this is how Auto-Maidan, Maidan with cars, was formed by these very people. When we realized that there is a need of legal aid, by that time legal aid or legal consultations were already provided by Euromaidan SOS initiative and hotlines, but we realized there is a need of physical consultations sometimes. And by that time it was already kind of automatic. We saw the problem, we decided we have to fix it. Every single group, I mean, they were very different. Spontaneously it just turned out that me and my 2-3 closest friends were sort of an affinity group. It just happened to be so. We decided we have to make a contact point of legal aid in one of the buildings occupied in the downtown Kyiv, and we did it. Then there was a problem with medicine delivery, and there was a need in the call center after the mass murders already in February. And it was almost automatic. We went, bought cheapest mobile phones, mobile cards, and set up call center by publishing numbers on Facebook and putting together those who could buy medicine and those who needed them. And this is how many different groups worked together, establishing networks, providing each other with very different things. It was extremely impressive. And this attracted a lot of people who at the beginning didn't feel themselves to be part of the protest. They saw that it is really bottom-up, it is not manipulated by anyone, and professional politicians who represented Maidan during the negotiations with Yanukovych, for instance, it was very obvious that they are tolerated by Maidan, but they are not ruling Maidan. The crowd didn't chant any name, and they did not want this guy for president or that guy for prime minister, or lady or something. And this really attracted a lot of people. Also, it was very visible that there is a Ukrainian line in terms of maybe Ukrainian sovereignty, but there is no particular ideology which would be followed by Maidan as a whole. And vast majority of people would not represent any specific ideology if asked, and maybe upon some reflection they would say that they are for citizens' rights and for human rights and for freedom and for mutual cooperation. And also people started to come from abroad, first to have a look what is it in reality, what it looks like, and many of them stayed. In particular, but of course not limited to, from Russian Federation. We have a number of people who participated in Maidan from Russia, activists or just concerned citizens. And it's a commonplace now in Ukrainian discourse that Russian flags were also at Maidan side by side with Ukrainian ones and other ones, like Armenian ones and Azeri ones and this and that. So it attracted as a phenomena, as history in making, but in my, of course, very subjective opinion, as everything else that I could say on this matter, because I'm part of the event, not a researcher. There's grassroots nature, network structure, and grassroots basic democratic demands, and maybe non-party, non-political party nature of the protest. This is what really attracted so many people, both from Ukraine and from abroad.
Excuse me, can I have one very small story? It is interesting indeed because Maksym underlined the role of Yanukovych in the popularizing of association agreement. Indeed, he was campaigning for this agreement, I mean, for some time before he rejected to sign it. And a few months ago, I met one volunteer in the liberated areas in the eastern Ukraine. He's a volunteer of one of the volunteer battalions called Donbass. Probably you've heard about it. So this is, he is a businessman from Donetsk. And I was asking him about his motivation, why he's here, what is he doing, and so on and so forth. And he said that he was an active participant of Euromaidan in Donetsk. And I asked him again, why? He said, you won't believe, but Yanukovych was the man who persuaded me that we have to sign this agreement. And he was campaigning so actively, and I read this agreement even, and I thought, yes, that is what I need, because I also need a clear rules for my business, because I'm tired of all this mafia stuff. And he persuaded me, and then when he rejected, I thought that, no, I'm not agree with that. So that's about the role of Yanukovych himself in the Euro revolution.
Yeah, thank you, both of you. Tatiana, having heard about the specific dynamic, the very vivid dynamic of the movement and also about the demands, I would like you to ask to give maybe a broader context. In the past 10 years, the Ukraine has experienced a constant series of protests, beginning with the Orange Revolution, followed by worker struggles, veteran uprisings and student movements. Why do you think that particularly these recent protests were so successful, and maybe could you say who are the protesters, who is maybe the typical protester on the Maidan?
Okay, so I must maybe I must say in the beginning that in my capacity as a scholar here, it's also very difficult for me to distance from these events, because I think for every Ukrainian they were kind of shaping experience of our lives. And I will be speaking, of course, also it's in this sense it's my subjective view. What was the Euromaidan revolution? I think it was a lot of things at the same time, and it was a very complex event which developed in several phases, and these phases were very different. Cornelia already mentioned how these events developed, and this protest, they had also various dimensions. And for example, for some observers, you would find a lot of parallels with the Occupy movement, for example, with other protests in other countries in the recent years, where angry citizens, so-called angry citizens, go to the streets, protest against corruption, protest against ignoring their voice, like it was in Gezi Park in Istanbul some years ago. And in this sense, Ukraine was not something exceptional. From the other perspective, you can, and some people would insist that what we had in Ukraine last year had to do with the unfinished 89 moment, so to say, so unfinished desovietization. What happened in Ukraine when Ukraine became independent, this kind of transition from the Soviet regime to the new democratic regime was not accomplished as in other countries of Eastern Europe, and we are now dealing with this Soviet legacy. You can somehow disagree with it, maybe, but this is also one of the possible approaches to what's going on in Ukraine. And for maybe some other people, what happened was kind of a moment of anti-colonial fight. Ukraine has been fighting for decades or even centuries, and in this sense, it's a moment of the national liberation struggle. Ukraine has been still struggling to become a real nation, and in this sense, Yanukovych regime was perceived as a kind of colonial, dependent on Russia, and not really Ukrainian. But what probably most protesters would agree on, that what happened in Ukraine was a mass revolt against the corrupt regime, increasingly authoritarian regime of the President Yanukovych, and it was labeled the revolution of dignity. So in this sense, this has become a dominant narrative in Ukraine. What happened was a fight of Ukrainian citizens for their rights, and according to the recent sociological survey done by the Democratic Initiatives Foundation, around 40% of Ukrainian citizens support this view that the Euromaidan was the organized fight of Ukrainian citizens for their rights. And another 17% believe that it was a spontaneous protest, and still some 30% still believe that it was a legitimate overthrow of the illegitimate overthrow of the Ukrainian government. So you have this kind of alternative narrative, which is also still present in Ukraine, and of course in some regions, especially in the east, more than in other regions. And speaking about various protests, and in fact the Orange Revolution was not the first mass protest in the post-Soviet Ukraine. We have Ukraine without Kuchma. We had students' protests before. We had Maidan protests, which were more about social and economic issues. And in the last years, there were protests against the new taxation law, which were also very kind of vocal. There were also protests against the language law, which Yanukovych kind of pushed, the law which guaranteed Russian the status of the regional language in some regions, and it was very controversial, and it caused some protests. But speaking about the Orange Revolution, maybe, and Maria mentioned that Orange Revolution was like a moment of actually of socialization for many, not only young people but also older people. I think one of the first events where like many Ukrainian citizens started to feel this kind of bond to their nation and their country. And when the protests last year started, I think we still had very much this Orange Revolution model in mind, and we expected also this protest to be peaceful and to be kind of, we very much believed in the culture of compromise, which somehow the Orange Revolution, a lot of things was somehow disappointing about the Orange Revolution, but the one thing that this crisis was solved in a peaceful way, I think became kind of element of Ukrainian political culture, and we very much believe that these protests also should be peaceful, and they should be the issue should be solved by compromise. That's why this police violence, I think, was such a shock for many Ukrainians. And of course, looking back at the Orange Revolution, I think what was different with the Orange Revolution and why it went peaceful was that it was the trigger of the protests was the electoral fraud, and the opposition was prepared in advance. There will be attempts to falsify the elections, and the protests were very much also organized by the political opposition and led by the political opposition. The protests had clear leaders like Yushchenko, Tymoshenko. They enjoyed a lot of trust at that time. What was different last year in Ukraine, I think, is that it was already mentioned that oppositional politicians did not enjoy much trust. And these protests were very much spontaneous and based on kind of grassroots initiatives, on self-organization. And the Orange Revolution, I think important thing was that there was a split of the ruling elite in Ukraine, and part of the elite supported the protests. Like, for example, at that time, the mayor of Kyiv actually provided the infrastructure for the protesters. And this time, nothing like that happened, and the protesters had to occupy public buildings by themselves. So, in fact, from the very beginning, also the agenda of the protests was, in the Orange Revolution, it was kind of clear agenda. We don't recognize the results of the second round, so, and it was a clear mechanism. We need like a third round of the elections, and it was easier. Of course, it was also not so easy to achieve this political compromise, but still, it was clear what we want to achieve. Yeah, I think in these protests, it was from the beginning. It was clear that the government is not going to make any secessions, and it frustrated protesters more and more that the more people go to the streets, the more like government becomes more resolute in insisting on their position. So it was not a single move to find a compromise, and this of course very much radicalized the protests, and especially with the dictatorial laws of January 16. Yeah, and speaking who were the protesters, I don't know, my colleagues maybe can add something on this. I think at various stages there were social and demographic composition was different, and also there were various forms of protests. So sociologists who studied protests, they actually spoke about Maidan as meeting, Maidan as camp, yeah, and Maidan as fortress. And in all these forms, you could, of course, you could find different people participating in these forms of protest. And for example, those who stayed on the streets in the Maidan camp, these were people outside of Kyiv, coming from the regions. Those who would go to the Sunday rallies, they were mostly people from Kyiv, citizens of Kyiv, but also people who would come over weekend to Kyiv to take part in these rallies. There were a lot of students, especially in the initial phase of the protests, and later I think Kyiv middle class also stepped in, but there were also people from the countryside, farmers, small entrepreneurs, a lot of, I think, frustrated people who kind of maybe came once or twice and then got kind of involved in this milieu and could not just go home because there's certainly some psychological mechanisms if you are in, and if you kind of already involved in this in these structures and you are part of the protesters. It's very good to it's very difficult just to give up. Yeah.
Okay, maybe if I can just one words. Recently, several filmmakers from Ukraine produced several films about Maidan. Internationally famous director Sergei Losnitsev produced this epic Maidan thing, which apparently was successful abroad but was met with a lot of criticism inside Ukraine. On the other hand, group of a coalition of young documentary filmmakers produced this Euromaidan rough cut And there are several others. But what I've heard from documentary filmmakers during the discussions, especially those who produced Euromaidan Rough Cut, they do not claim to really portray Maidan as it was, because there was huge hidden part, maybe the most important. With visuals, one could go to the central square, to Maidan, and film the camp, the fortress, the kitchen, the lecture at the Open University of Maidan, the barricades, the street battle. But when it was about the supplies, people who cooked, about the wood which was brought in, but specifically about legal assistance, and about social assistance and psychologists, about these numerous hotlines. There were dozens of hotlines organized by different initiatives, people who were not physically at Maidan. They were scattered around the landscape in different apartments in Kyiv, taking these hundreds of phone calls every day, redirecting, helping people, etc. This is what also made Maidan possible, but it's really difficult to film. And it was not in this way. So this part is really important, and this also was different in terms of composition, demographic, social, and gender composition, of course, from those who were present at Maidan as a camp and as a fortress.
I just want also to say that to make like a picture of what is the portrait of Maidan, you can just look on the list of the killed people. There are really very different people who were killed there. It is people of different nationality, Armenian, Georgian, Belarusian, Ukrainian. So, and that's and different ages, beginning with the students and up to people who are really like after 60, I think they're quite elder. And people of different professions who are dealing with very different things, teachers also women even. So it's very complicated. It's kind of really a portrait of the whole society. So, yeah, exactly.
But Maria, if I could ask you maybe a little bit more about the structure of the protests themselves, because we heard a lot about self-organized initiatives, several kinds of movements, networks, but also about the type of protester. So maybe could you say, maybe elaborate more on how, in what case, or how did you perceive the protests as democratic ones in their, in their structure, and maybe also by giving some examples, maybe how were decisions made? Were there some collective decision processes, or how equally was the right distributed to the right to speak distributed among the protesters? Could you say something about that?
I will not go deep into the all these kind of initiatives because Maksym already did. But I just want to underline again that it was not the protest of political opposition. That's why it was not well structured in some way. I mean, in the sense of decision making. Of course, but there were tricks. For example, the biggest protest actions, not the actions, but so-called BUTKEVYCH, which happened every Sunday on the Maidan. They had like the main speakers. That was called politicians. And they tried in some way to form the agenda of the protest. But I think it wasn't successful, actually, because I just will give one example. Maybe lots of you know this. When there was a kind of agreement on the 21st of February between Yanukovych, political opposition, in the presence of ministers of foreign affairs of European countries. So they agreed on some points which were mentioned by your colleague, but then suddenly people said that they will not accept it. Who made this decision? I don't know. People made this decision. And but on the other hand, of course, all the time there were attempts of politicians to put the protest under their control and to get some benefits for themselves. And just to give another example, it was the second day of the protest. I remember it very clear. It was not so many people at that moment, but politicians understood opposition, understood that it's a chance for them to jump out and to get some benefits. And the car of Klitschko's party came to Maidan, and it was like lots of the signs of his party, Udar, was there, and people were very unsatisfied. And they said, you have to take it away, all these symbolics, because we will not accept that. It's not the circus like it was before. No, thank you. And they had to get rid of these symbolics, and then, I mean, he was accepted, Klitschko, as a figure, not as a leader, but as one of the protesters. About the structure, I mean, it is interesting because I just give you another example and then pass the word to Maksym. When Maidan ended and Yulia Tymoshenko was released, it was very interesting also how she is perceived and what she was trying to propose to the society. And yes, she was a political prisoner, that's for sure, but she didn't get any kind of support, real support in the society. Because Tymoshenko is, in any way, she is a representative of the same system, and she even tried to use the same tricks. But suddenly she understood that the society has changed, that people will not react on that cheap tricks, and that she is not actually in the context at all. And I think one of the very interesting and very important things about Maidan itself is that it showed that society is much more like grown up than politicians in many sense. And first of all, in the sense of agenda, of how society itself, the progressive part of the society, sees the development of the society. And that was one of the, I think, important things which were of this.
Okay, since we are a little bit short in time, I would ask two more questions and then pass over to the floor. I think what maybe was the people here probably struggled with the Maidan because the informations on what the protest really consisted of were very different. We sometimes you could, according also to the media, you could read extensively more about right-wing forces taking part in the process, or rather not. So I would like to ask you, Maksym, how these different heterogeneous groups from far left to far right were actually working together on the Maidan, and to what extent it was possible to formulate any coherent strategy then. And maybe with regard to your background and your work, how was it possible for your group actually to deal with people that you are actually, fight in your day-to-day work?
That's one of the most complicated questions, of course, to ask. It can be split into several, but I won't do that due to time limits. What can probably said in the first place is that the visible presence of the far right as well at Maidan at the very beginning was not that significant. At the beginning, I mean this Euromaidan about association agreement stage. Those who were there could probably rather be described as people of vaguely liberal beliefs in political terms. There were, of course, groups of the far-right youth present, but they were marginal and they were perceived as being marginal by the protesters. But in the first place, because that was not their protest. They were never for the EU association agreement. They were never for freedom of speech. They were never for anti-discrimination rules. They were never for human rights. It was not their agenda. They were against all of it. But they were also against the Yanukovych regime. This is why they came, as well as many other people came, and some left-wing groups. Some because, as I mentioned before, economic part of the association agreement really constrained non-authoritarian left-wing milieu of Kyiv at the time. And later on, some of left-wing activists told me, basically we lost momentum. We didn't come soon enough. Still, there were socialist, non-authoritarian socialist groups, anarchists, some of them, and radical feminist groups which participated in the first stage of Euromaidan. And there were some skirmishes between the far left and the far right groups. But maybe combined together, they would not consist even 3 or 5% of the protesters. The vast majority did not have any clear extreme political agenda. Then when the number of these marginal groupuscules on the far right end of the political spectrum realized how insignificant they were, they had to be more visible, and they formed the coalition, which by purely territorial composition of that time camp, it was on the right. It was called the right sector, which obviously straight away had ideological meaning to it, because they were the most far right force there, and they were perceived as something dodgy and rather provocative by other protesters for first about 1.5 months of the protests. As long as protests stayed peaceful until mid-January, they were marginal. And then situation changed. Of course, it didn't change overnight, it changed slowly. Just to mention that in the first month of the protest, there were a lot of self-made stickers and posters and leaflets produced by various groups. There was a special activist initiative producing this kind of social activist advertisement, and one of them was take off your balaclava. If you are wearing, and then in small letters, wearing balaclava at the protest, you show that you are a provocator or police provocator. And again, everything changed in mid-January when protests turned violent. I wouldn't say that it was possible to find a coherent strategy between different, including far-right and anti-fascist groups. It was really strange, I have to confess. I'm saying this at every event if there is any about Euromaidan protest. It was really strange to be side by side with people who knew that I'm part of a group which monitors their activity and helps refugees and assists victims of hate crimes committed by them. So they knew us, of course, and of course we knew them. And it was like, you know, this dodgy look like, you are here as well. Okay, this time we'll just pass by. It was dodgy, but it was a strange feeling. But I wouldn't say it produced any doubts about me being there. As I mentioned already, I knew why I'm there, because the values of the protest were my values. I couldn't clearly understand what they are doing there. the values of the protest were not their values. And the protest not at any single moment was for had any like xenophobic connotation or something like that. And of course, again, the vast majority of the protesters were not represented by any particular group or organization or a party, as I mentioned already. And unfortunately, things changed in mid-January, not in terms of representation, but in terms of how some of these groups were perceived. The right sector became a very popular group, and it became popular due to, not due to ideology. I don't think many people actually understand what the right sector's ideology is. It is rather ultra-conservative, militant, with based on what they perceive as being Christian values. They were always very open about being against any form of racism, and they always insisted that they are nationalists, far-right nationalists, but rather in political than ethnic terms. And they actually proved it several times in a row. But the right sector was the only one which, among these significant groups, which claimed all of the time that they are ready to use violence if necessary. This is why they were perceived as provocators until the very moment when maybe half or majority of the protesters said, okay, like, now it's the end of this fairy tale of nonviolence we used to have. It is an issue of survival. And this is what changed in the mood of the protest in January. There was a moment in time, specifically under the dictatorial laws were adopted, which, as a matter of fact, tried to introduce the state of emergency in the country without naming it, the state of emergency. Under proper work of legislation, that would be actually attempt of coup d'etat made by the president and the parliament. And then there was this feeling that it's either state authorities which will crush the protest brutally, with brutal force, with people in prison and killed and thrown out of the country, or the authorities will be overthrown. And this is what changed the whole picture. And suddenly there was one, at least, political group, which all of this time said, we have no ties with the Yanukovych regime and we will not compromise with them. We are ready to use violence, and we will fight and we will win. And this group was also heavily popularized by, last but not least, Russian TV, surprisingly. They all the time said, look, Maidan is made up by Nazis. The right sector is there, they are ruling everything. The right sector is the most significant force at the protest. And Ukrainians watched Russian TV as well. So at some moment, some quite significant number of youth said, well, if Kremlin TV says right sector is bad, maybe there is something good about it. We should join. It sounds like a joke, but that was the case. I've heard it myself from several people. They were convinced to at least go and talk to the right sector due to pro-Yanukovych and pro-Kremlin media, which portrayed them most evil. But still, just to wrap it up, the political composition of the protest was extremely diverse. But there were several things absent from that. There were conflicts between different political groups. Don't get me wrong. There were verbal conflicts. There were physical skirmishes, several, mostly attacks committed by the far right. Maybe 3 incidents come to my mind in these months of the protest. But in general terms, everyone understood that compromise is something that is needed. The commandant of the building taken over by the protesters, where we had this our contact point for legal aid, was from the far-right Svoboda party. And he knew that I'm an anti-fascist. And the group which has made film screenings for the protesters was from non-authoritarian socialists and anarchists. And basically, he had no problem with them forming film's agenda and us providing legal aid. He is rather an exception for his party, I should say. He is not a rule for far-right Svoboda party. But that shows what it looked like. Also, he did it not because he was so nice. He had no other choice. He had to accept all groups which joined the protest. Xenophobia and racism were absent from Maidan. This is also quite significant because when we saw organized far-right groups, some of them here and there at the protest, of course we were worried. But then probably it was one of the most multilingual and multi-ethnic and multi-religious event I attended in my life. Most protesters spoke Ukrainian during the night, Russian during the rally, because during the night there were only those who arrived from the countryside staying. During the day and during the rally there were people from Kyiv who arrived. Usual thing was to ask a question in Ukrainian to get an answer in Russian. At this stage, if there were any religious clergy, they were from all walks of religions in Ukraine, including not only different Christian denominations, but also Muslims and Buddhists and Jewish communities. And of course, after the first Maidan protester was killed, and then second Maidan protester was killed, all or any representation of ethnic xenophobic views at Maidan were made totally impossible. Because the first one was Sergei Nigoyan, an ethnic Armenian from a refugee family, and the second one was Zhizhnevsky from Belarus himself. So the first people who died for, as it was formulated, freedom of Ukrainian people were ethnic Armenian and ethnic Belarus. And no single, even far-right activist could, since then, say at Maidan that they are for pure Ukrainian ethnic nation. That would be nonsense. But of course, again, to re-emphasize, it's not to make it too smooth. The presence of the far-right groups at Maidan was a problem. It was a problem for us, it was a problem for our vision, and media coverage was also a problem. They were very, very comfortable for pro-Russian media, and they were extremely worrying for international media. I have to say we were at some point irritated by a lot of requests we received from international media about the far-right, our group. It was understandable, but we received them at the beginning of December, then mid-December when there were first attempts to disperse Maidan. Then there were dictatorial laws, and we received requests about the far-right at Maidan. Then first people were killed, then first people were kidnapped, then protesters, some of them were tortured to death, and then there was a wall of fire of the night from 18th to 19th of February, when the picture was totally apocalyptic and it looked like we are going to be crushed by Iron Fist. And then there was Day of the Heavenly Hundred of snipers, morning of snipers, and then Yanukovych was gone. And at all these points we received requests a lot about the presence of the far-right at Maidan, more than about what was actually going on. It really seemed to us that the issue in media, not local ones, but like international ones, starts to get terribly overblown. And of course we were happy to get results of the elections. It's not to say that I'm a big fan of electoral democracy or vice versa, but it just proved what we've seen. No far-right group got significant results, and this parliament is much less to the right than the parliament under the Yanukovych regime. This is what we knew all this time, but this became a real surprise for some of, even of our friends from abroad.
Just to add one thing, very short, about the language issue, because it's perceived by some people as an issue for Ukraine. It's not an issue at all, it's not a problem. It was an object for the political speculations. But I just want to quote the yesterday's discussion. The ambassador from Switzerland, who is presented in the Sweden, sorry, in OSCE, he said a very interesting thing, which is obvious from his perspective, but not from ours. But it's interesting. He mentioned that Maidan was the biggest Russian-speaking demonstration, revolution, or just demonstration in the post-Soviet history, and it's true. And it happened in Kyiv. So it's very interesting and very significant, all these kind of things.
I think he was quoting Timothy Snyder or something.
Timothy Snyder.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I can remember.
One final question, and I have to unfortunately ask you to be short on it. But when I follow now your thoughts, I have the impression that the demonstrations were motivated by the desire for self-independency and maybe national sovereignty. So, could you confirm this idea, or would you maybe disagree? And finally, also, how was this idea maybe differently interpreted in several regions with regard to protests?
I think in the beginning of the protests in the east and in the south of Ukraine, like everywhere, those people who came to the streets to protest, they actually came with the pro-European agenda. Yeah? So they were really frustrated by the fact that the government decided to postpone signing this association agreement, and the initial protests were rather under the pro-European slogans. And indeed, of course, if you look, I'm from the east myself. I'm from Kharkiv, and protests were on a much smaller scale in the east, and in the south, probably in Odessa. Odessa was one of the cities which was on the 10 top cities where the protests were most massive. Yeah, and there are various reasons for this. Odessa was a kind of exception. But otherwise, in Kharkiv, in Lugansk, in Donetsk, in Zaporizhzhia, there were like maybe 100, 200, 300 people gathering in the city center. But these were small demonstrations, and it was very much about, I think, more like a cultural performance. For example, in Kharkiv, there were various rock bands playing Ukrainian music. There was always Sergei Zhadan, who is a famous Ukrainian writer living in Kharkiv, and he was always like animating these events. But they were more like cultural gatherings, and they actually, for example, in Kharkiv, they took place in the central square, Shevchenko Square, because actually the biggest square in Kharkiv was kind of fenced by the mayor, again with the same pretext to construct the New Year tree and all kind of entertainment infrastructure. So it was closed and not accessible for people to prevent demonstrations. So people gathered near Taras Shevchenko monument in Kharkiv. And this kind of demonstrations, they were rather small, and actually many activists from eastern Ukraine, they would rather go to Kyiv to take part in the Kyiv Maidan. And already at that time they were under a lot of pressure. Their cars were demolished. They were threatened. They were often there were several cases when the office of the activists were attacked. Their cars were put in fire. And then, as the situation in Kyiv radicalized, it also radicalized in the east, and the violent clashes between the Maidan activists and the so-called anti-Maidan, they became quite often, and actually the worst experience we had in the East, this was probably from February, March, April last year, when really like for weeks and months there was this pro-Russian rallies, and Ukrainian flags were taken from the public buildings and Russian flags were installed, and it was not clear at all what is the position of the local authorities, why they don't react, where is the police, where is the security service, why they are doing nothing, who are these people actually running around with the Russian flags. Are they these local people, are these people from other regions, are these people from Russia? So these were really days of fear and anxiety. So I would say different regions in Ukraine, they had different experience of these events, and at the same time, of course, I think this is what happened in Kyiv and what happened after, I mean, the annexation of Crimea and also the war in Donbass. This is something which kind of Ukraine became a melting pot very much, and I think it's a kind of new community emerging from this very dramatic experience, because people from Western Ukraine are now fighting in Donbass, and for them it's not an abstract Donbass anymore, which most Western Ukrainians never saw in their lives. And yeah, I should probably stop here.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for all your comments, and I would just ask you if you have any questions. Maybe before you ask it or pull it, actually, I would be very glad if you could shortly introduce yourself and say your affiliation. So please, the floor is open for discussion, or we can also continue with my question. Please.
Maybe one short comment or question. I'm wondering actually why the events in Fradyivka, right, in southern Ukraine, did not spark broader protests. I mean, that took place, if I'm not mistaken, in July 2013 in Mykolaiv Oblast, right, which was actually a stronghold of the Yanukovych party. And people became that infuriated due to the fact that, I mean, girls were raped by local policemen who were not punished. And so that's the question, why it was Maidan, or maybe it's because it was in the countryside and no one was really interested in it.
It's an interesting question. I have no concrete answer to this question, why it did not provoke. I mean, it provoked something, but you know, in Ukraine, the issue, the problem of police violence, it's a huge problem. I mean, it was a problem before, and now it just gets more visible as we get the people who are tortured on the occupied territories and who are kept by the unlawful armed groups, which are in, to the big extent, content of law enforcement representatives of the eastern Ukraine. Maybe society was not ready at that moment to wake up. Maybe it's because the crackdown on the students' Maidan was too rude. I mean, in the sense that it happened in the city center and it was very brutal. I mean, I don't know why actually, but it only shows. But what it I mean, it is interesting in the sense that if we see on the context of the current Russian context, it is very also discussed now whether can be in Russia something like Maidan. Is it possible? So, Ukrainian case shows that you cannot predict. I mean, today it is not possible, tomorrow it will be possible, and anything can provoke it. That's actually, and one interesting thing I just recall now, it's in my memory, concerning the issues which were discussed previously. A few months ago, one of our Russian colleagues from Memorial, it's a human rights foundation, he asked me, how did you perceive Maidan when it started actually with the message in the Facebook of our colleague? He's a journalist, now he's an MP, by the way, member of Ukrainian parliament. How did you perceive the fact that he's an Afghanistani himself? I said, I did not even think about it. I mean, it's not even, did you notice that it wasn't in the agenda at all? I mean, it's not about your question, but still it's very interesting because he said that he and his colleagues, they used to think about it, how it will be perceived and so on. So, but I think it just shows that in such circumstances when it's very tough in society, the situation is very unclear, and anything can provoke the beginning of some revolution or movements or stuff like that.
Maybe just few words to add from a different perspective. I think actually events in Radivka provoked Maidan. I think so, but not directly. It's not like cops were caught raping ladies in Radivka and this provoked Maidan. Radivka was the most significant, but not the only one, local riot, which, like local riots, is not something usual for Ukraine. As it was said before, culture of politically motivated violence and open group violence is not something usual. So suddenly in Radivka and here and there, locals tried to storm a local police station, being furious about this or that. There was a tension in the air. It was felt and was demonstrated by all these events, and events being reported in media passed the message to wider audience. We have a problem and we have growing discontent in the country. Just as an anecdote, the role of taxists for sociologists in cities they don't know. Taxi drivers tell stories about local atmosphere, and I remember the impression that local taxi drivers in different places started to talk more and more about politics to me if they wanted to talk. And they were more and more openly aggressive towards the authorities, including openly hostile speech about preparation to active physical confrontation with police. It was months before the Maidan started. So I think that was one of the bricks in the foundation of Maidan. That was and also maybe one more thing, what many protesters mentioned afterwards. Cops in Radivka at the end of the day were at least arrested, sent out, and it was investigated and punishment was promised about them. A lot of protesters said afterwards that at the beginning of Euromaidan protests, if Yanukovych took steps accordingly, would fire Kyiv police chief after the beating of students, would fire the Minister of Interior, and would announce investigation into that. Who cares will it happen or not, but the announcements had to be made. Majority of the protesters would just leave. They wanted the people responsible for the beating to be brought to justice. But as long as the authorities did not react whatsoever, and the protests continued, and protesters started to feel themselves being a community, This is what was absent at the beginning. They more and more started to feel themselves being a community of people with desire for radical change in the society. Actually, they laid foundations for the current volunteer movement. They felt more empowered than ever. At the time of Radivka, it was not the case at all. People were afraid they did not feel being responsible for each other, like they do now.
Christina, please.
Yeah. I'm happy to. Well, thanks a lot for having me here. Thanks for the organizing. I'm Christina Plank. I'm a PhD student at the Department of Political Science and lecturer. And since we have in the title Maidan and Beyond, I wanted just to give or to ask you that short question: what happened to the grassroots initiatives you were mentioning before, and to your initiatives you were part of after February 2014?
Well, they didn't go anywhere. They changed their shape, and still there is. Well, of course, yeah, it's a bit complicated. But to make it more simple, probably. After Maidan, after Yanukovych's fled, there was about a week's time when the situation was totally unstable, in Kyiv including, and at the same time many different groups and associations and unions started to demand and put forward practical suggestions on how to reform the system of governance in Ukraine in their respective fields. Someone started to actively promote what they would like to see as a police reform to prevent further police violence and torture and beatings. Someone worked on courts and prosecution. We traditionally working with assistance to refugees. We wanted to have asylum system reform, a radical one, because the asylum system in Ukraine was a scandal. And it is a scandal still, I mean, but it was even worse. And some groups just made coalitions and started to work together on that in their offices or apartments. Some started to take over administrative buildings. We did both. We occupied the state migration service. Not in order to stop it, to prevent it from working further. We wanted it to work actually, and to consider asylum applications further. But we wanted the service staff to prevent them from destroying the documents, the papers, which would probably incriminate someone into politically motivated asylum decisions. And we wanted to demand the leadership of the service to go and the reform of the asylum system. And also, among other things, we wanted to secure the private data of foreign nationals and refugees specifically for being taken over by any far-right group. We wanted to occupy it first before any other group would do that, basically. And I mean, we were just an example that was done by many others. Our occupation was later called by many people model occupation, and all parties commit themselves to the reform of the asylum system. It was all changed dramatically by the beginning of March. By the 1st of March, by the beginning of the Russian occupation of Crimea. Of course, it was not anymore about any radical reforms right now and here. It was that just out of the bloody, potentially revolutionary events in Kyiv, we are at war. It was a nightmare. It was a total shock for the whole population and for activist circles in particular. So the vast majority of those whom I know who were active during Maidan, they are now part of volunteer networks and groups. They deal with internally displaced persons. We never had internally displaced persons in modern Ukrainian history, but we've also never had foreign occupation since World War II. We never had open war on the territory of independent Ukraine in its modern history neither. So we have a lot of things which we never had before. But we've never had such a huge level of civic mobilizations we have now, when volunteer groups, not the state authorities and living alone, not the political parties, are the backbone of the support system for internally displaced persons, for people in different dire need, for volunteers and for soldiers at the front line. I know this issue is not very popular abroad, but this is a fact. Suddenly activists realized that Ukraine doesn't have an army. It has formally armed forces, but it doesn't have anything to defend itself from the foreign occupation. So the army was basically reinstalled by the collective effort of volunteer groups mostly, and only then it started to be more state-like. So most of these networks and groups, they remain being networks and groups dealing with volunteer efforts for IDPs and for the front line and for liberated territories. They also continue to work in the direction of radical reforms in their respective fields. There are a lot of networks and coalitions uniting different affinity groups and civic initiatives and NGOs committed to reforms and monitoring of the state authority actions also in different fields. So they are there, basically. Our group, it was not only far left, it was those who were there, they were either anarchists or vaguely non-authoritarian left or just Protestants. But we dealt with practical issues like coordination of delivery of medicine, but because we worked with refugees before and we continue to do so, now we have more refugees from Russia than in previous several years combined. I mean, people who apply for asylum in Ukraine being Russian nationals. It is for the first time. Due to political persecution for their anti-war, pro-Ukrainian or pro-Maidan position. We never had it before. But dealing with refugees before, we realized still in March that we'll have a problem of IDP situation, internally displaced persons, and we started to work with them and for them. And this is my main focus now, both on level of legislation and legal assistance and psychological assistance, but also humanitarian aid and medicine and clothes. We barely cope. I wouldn't say we really cope with the requests, but this winter is still merciful so far. It is quite warm. We have very tough forecasts for end of January and for February. Very cold period of time, and that might be the most disastrous, again, winter in modern Ukrainian history, specifically for IDPs. So it will be tough. It will be even tougher.
Most of our volunteers who were involved in Euromaidan SOS, they switched to the help of the army, but as for the some of people who are involved in this initiative and ours, personally me and some other people, they feel like obliged to follow the investigation on Maidan crimes. And we try to follow it very closely, and also our contribution, I think it's a very important contribution, was in preparing the materials for International Criminal Court, who probably will take like the case of Maidan and to investigate it. Because we had the huge amount of information about people who were kidnapped, who were injured, who were detained, and so on. So, this is very important, I think, also. And of course, with the beginning of Crimean occupation, which was connected also with the numerous cases of kidnapping people and torturing them, we are making like the list of these people detained. We are documenting these cases. When it was possible, we went to Crimea and to Donbass to support the local civil society, to pass them our experience in those kind of things. Unfortunately, now it is not possible. We cannot go there because we perceived them as enemies by unlawful armed groups, and it's really very much dangerous. And you know, it's very interesting to follow. It's very complicated to say in whole what has happened with the volunteers, because every single person has its own path, you know, in the frames of all that events. For example, a few days ago, I got a message from one of the guys who was involved in the so-called doctors' community on Maidan. They were providing medicine help to the protesters, and he wrote that he is now in one of the volunteer battalions in the east. And we have, I mean, very different stories. It always depends on people, but what we can say in general, that among those people who were involved as volunteers in Maidan, you cannot find people who doesn't care about what is happening now in Ukraine. All of them are involved in this situation, and probably most of them try to help with what they can do. So that's for sure.
Okay, we're way past time, but you're very endurant. So if you would like to ask one more question, of course, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a political question. And how would you evaluate the efforts of Western governments to help the protesters in Maidan?
What do you mean to help?
To help.
Exactly?
Just leave it that vague. Sometimes it's material, sometimes I'm from the US, I was embarrassed some of the communication that was released, I think by Russian hackers, about how crude the US ambassador was in Kyiv and trying to sort things out.
You know, it was a myth which was created during the Orange Revolution, that on Maidan there are some oranges who are which are filled with some kind of chemical things which make people protest, you know, all the bullshit. And you know, it was really funny for us, but people did believe in that. I mean, all over the country. And same now. It's, you know, it hurts me when people think that Ukrainians are not capable of fighting for their rights. We were really grateful for the support of the whole world, US, EU, Russians, protesters, and all of them. Because it was not, I mean, US who, I mean, initiated this. I mean, it's really, it's even complicated to comment it, because, I mean, no, it's not. Those were Ukrainians who just wanted Ukrainian political nation, I would say, who wanted to stand for their rights and who didn't want to get in this trap of authoritarianism, because we see very clearly what is happening in Russia now. We didn't want this happen to us.
Of course, it depends who you ask. When someone from the public figures, no matter is it politician or is it a cultural or art figure, arrived to Maidan during the protests, it was received with gratitude because it made Maidan more visible for the world. We understood that under the worst case scenario, visibility internationally will be very important. But when it afterwards came to the war situation, to occupation of Crimea, and then to war in the east, most people I know, they were disappointed specifically by political structure's reaction when it comes to the EU, and to a less extent, but by the US. They expected swifter and more radical support or solidarity, expression of solidarity with post-Yanukovych Ukraine for a number of reasons. Well, even there was this joke started to go around in Ukraine. We're extremely concerned, we're deeply concerned, and we're extremely worried. If you asked someone, do you know that this bad thing happened? And the person responded, oh, I'm extremely concerned. That made, I don't give a damn. Because that was a quote from the official statements of the EU structure. You know, we are occupied here. Oh, we're extremely concerned. You know, we are at war with the biggest neighbor and one of the biggest powers in the world. Oh, we are deeply worried. Basically,
what's the way out? I'm sorry. What kind of reaction would you expect from the West or from Europe?
well, what
That
we
would mean another war. That's the problem.
it was well.
At least they should not say we are not going to fight for Ukraine. NATO is not going to fight. NATO is not going to defend Ukraine. At least you should not say this.
But
But
especially,
they have no right to.
but
do so.
especially,
The Ukraine is not to come.
especially,
Yeah, but you
especially.
should not say this.
No, especially at that time, sanctions which were introduced later on, they had to be introduced straight away. Why it took several months to do something very obvious when you see a huge power? Okay, no one cares about Ukraine, like frankly, right? But we've seen the post-World War II security system in Europe being destroyed. It's the first time when one power in post-war Europe occupied a territory of another country in post-war Europe by force. First time. All agreements, all these Helsinki Act and all this other stuff means nothing now. And all agreements, including this beautiful Budapest memorandum signed by 4 guarantees, Russia is one of them, is cheaper than the sheet of paper it is printed upon. And one more thing, which is also usually forgotten, which Ukrainians used to be vaguely, but most of those I know, sort of proud of. Ukraine is the only country in the world which was either cool enough or stupid enough to just give up its nuclear arsenal for free at the beginning of the 90s, just due to desire to become nuclear free and due to desire to reduce the nuclear weapons stock in the world. And it was actually, I don't remember, 3rd or 4th size, in terms of size, arsenal, in return of international guarantees of its territorial integrity. So what arguments can be presented now to any state in the world which is capable and which wants to design a bomb? International guarantees after Ukraine? No, you must be joking. There is no argument. It's about proliferation and it's about the bomb. So it is not really Ukrainian affair. It is the EU affair, it is the US affair, and all other states and coalitions concerned. So sanctions had to be introduced in March, leaving alone other tools. So a lot of people were disappointed. That really not, and of course, one more thing is this pro-European streak in the nature of protest. Of course, no one expected Ukraine to be part of the EU straight away. But now we basically see, we as people, not as political organizations or something, due to war, due to other things, but bigger restrictions on movement of Ukrainian nationals to the EU countries. Bigger, not smaller, leaving alone not visa-free regime, of course. So Ukrainians, there was this romantic and maybe not very wise phrase being said during the end of the protest, that Ukraine is the only country where people paid for their pro-European aspirations with blood. And there was this very popular drawing of the EU flag where stars are replaced by the bullet holes. Okay, I mean, it's romanticism, it has nothing to do with politics, but if Ukrainian people could express their pro-European aspirations, they did it. But it takes two to tango, and the Ukraine-EU association agreement maybe is not sufficient for people feeling that, yes, the EU reaction was cool. So there is a lot of respect for the finally support, at least in terms of sanctions against the aggressor. And don't get me wrong, people in Ukraine do not perceive what goes on in the East as the civil war. They perceive it as Russian-Ukrainian war only. But there is a gratitude, but there is disappointment as well.
Tatjana, maybe you want to comment also?
No,
If you allow, I will say just one thing. I think that's a huge issue for EU now to establish a kind of new Russian policy. Because, I mean, what should be the strategy of EU towards Russia? Personally, me, I don't have an answer to this question. Of course, I understand that EU officials are afraid of Russia, on one hand. On the other hand, what I clearly see is that lots of people, I mean, it's according to my experience of communication, lots of people underestimate the threat of Russia. Not the threat of Russia for Ukraine, but the threat of Russia to EU. Personally, me, I see this threat. Maybe something, I mean, but I think it's very important now to understand what should be the strategy. At this moment, I don't see some clear picture of EU's attitude towards Russia, because it's kind of balancing all the time. But what should be the response? I don't know, but it should be discussed and decided. And one significant detail is just to give you an imagination of who were those people who were killed on Maidan. Lots of them, while funeral, their bodies were covered with EU flags. You may perceive it as a pathetic thing from the 19th century, but excuse me, Ukraine lives in the 19th century because we have Russian aggression towards us. And it's not, I mean, it's not the agenda which is for EU discussed. I mean, I see that you're discussing the economical problems and all this kind of stuff, but guys, we're very far now from here, from that kind of agenda. Now we just try to survive, at least. And this distance in understanding what Europe is, basically, it's also very significant detail which provokes misunderstanding.
Don't get me wrong, I think if Austria were occupied by the Russians, NATO wouldn't come and intervene either. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think that's the point really, and I think it was a wake-up call at least to see how Russia reacts and what is possible. I don't think anyone would have thought, never ever, that it was so easy to sort of get the Crimea, and nobody does anything against it. And they have elections, but everybody knows that how these elections were organized or how things ended up.
Oh, by the way,
There's one more question by...
Yeah, I feel a little bit that we discuss in a way in which it is not possible to speak about Maidan, but about the international situation at the moment. I'm not sure about whether we are able to do this in a proper way. But I mean, for Ukraine as well, it is Dieter Segert from the Institute for Political Science. But in my understanding, one really important actor is not mentioned, and it would be interest for me. That is oligarchs. Tatjana spoke about that too, that the Orange Revolution was a split in the elite, I mean in the economic and political elite. And a question for me, because there are different information, is are there several parts of the rich people in Ukraine? Because Ukrainians are not only Ukrainians. Ukrainians are poor and rich and different classes as well. And what is about the rich people? In which direction they try to influence, or were they not able to influence the Maidan? Because I mean, the political parties you spoke about, relationship between the spontaneous actions and developments of networks of people and protesters, and about political parties and their interests. But what about the rich people? What about Kolomoisky or Poroshenko? I heard about that they supported Maidan financially. Isn't that true? Is that true, or how you perceive this? So, because this group of people are still really influential in your politics after Maidan.
And maybe adding,
more on the international side, but adding also to the rich people. What about the IMF? Is it a topic now in public discourse? Or how do you perceive its influence?
who would like to start?
Okay. Yes, thank you very much, because this question is kind of, it's obvious, but it's not as often as it should be. Of course, oligarchs, owners of big industrial and financial groups, are not only still very influential, they're still the key players in Ukrainian political developments, and they control different groups of interest, control different, for instance, lawmakers. While still in the new parliament, it is not the case to that extent, but and the role of oligarchs cannot be underestimated. Regarding who supported and to what extent supported Maidan, I don't think I have an answer, and I don't think anyone has an answer, because the information is very controversial. Of course, there was some support. It was rather participation in these supply networks. Okay, I already told about people who cooked soup and brought it. Someone else could provide more significant assistance, and someone else even more significant assistance. But I saw and I heard no proof that there was any strategically key, let's say, investment into Maidan by any particular oligarch. That was rather part of the supply chain, or supply efforts, maybe not more than that. Of course, the interests of the poor and rich and some imaginary or non-imaginary middle class differ in different situations. But Yanukovych is actually a unique politician in many aspects, and this is one of them. He managed to make people from very different social backgrounds to unite against him. The absence of the rules of the game when it comes to different aspects of social life, is it justice system, or police violence, or way of doing business in Ukraine, got on nerves of more or less everyone. And business people, again of different scale, got tired of, as Maria quite rightly said, mafia-style way of doing business. They had no guarantees that after investing something into their business today, this business will not be taken from them tomorrow. Even oligarchs who supported those who supported Yanukovych, or those who made him, produced him as such, they started to have voice, because instead of making them rich, he started to make his own family rich. And his son became one in the top 3 or top 5 oligarchs in Ukraine in very short period of time, specifically because his daddy was a president. So of course other oligarchs looked at this with suspicion and worries. So yeah, there were different actors in play. But then events in the regions, they were different. What happened in Lugansk region, for instance, starting with pro-Russian campaign, which ended with violent overtaking Lugansk and creation of the so-called Lugansk People's Republic, was the whole project of Sergei Yefremov, who was local governor and local oligarch, a person who supposed this way to defend his business and political interests. Full party of regions also, and he lost control within a short period of time, not even over movement of people he basically armed, but other more powerful actors from Russia came into play and pushed him aside. And the same with Rinat Akhmetov, who kept silent and still keeps suspiciously silent about events in Donetsk, but it looks like the scenario was the same. He wanted to blackmail new Kyiv government with his officially independent from him armed forces of Donetsk People's Republic, until it turned out that now it's not his project anymore, it's project of Kremlin. So of course oligarchs try to use the situation on different sides coming into play. But that is perceived by, at least by this huge activist and volunteer movement which emerged during Maidan, which we've never had before, with suspicion and with discontent. One of the messages of Maidan was against oligarchs. Also because it was about, as I said several times, but it also applied here, transparent rules of the game. It was about people who wanted to have influence on politicians directly, not about oligarchs who controlled politicians and who decided whether they should listen to the people or not. People, I mean, in this case, rather working class and middle class, of course. So this anti-oligarch sentiment is not fulfilled in any possible way. Taxation system is not changed into the way of more socially just, and system of checks and balances which would prevent financial industrial groups from influencing decision-making political process is not in place. And this makes a lot of people not only discontent but active as activists in the reforms process. They consider it to be one of the tasks of Maidan, still unfulfilled. And here where IMF issue comes into play, it is really difficult. Of course, in a country and society torn apart by war, having these demands, which included demands for social justice, to make extremely harsh economic steps, making gas price and electricity price higher, removing some of the social assistance packages. To say it is risky, basically, it is very risky. On the other hand, these steps and similar proposals are now perceived by many in Ukraine. No, it's not economy of welfare. It's rather the mood is about war economy of misery. It's about survival. They explain that the budget is empty, that we have no money, just no. We need any international assistance possible. Okay, this is not assistance, this is a loan. We will pay back with a bigger amount of money, but it will be later on. We need to live through this winter. A lot of people actually think like we need to live through this winter. We need to survive springtime military campaign, which everyone is more or less aware of. Launched not by Ukrainian side. Everyone is more or less sure that Russian side will launch massive military actions in springtime. No later than that, at least. And then, when there is peace, we will work hard and we repay. But now we need it very soon. And this is a very tough issue. If the demands for cutting social assistance and increasing prices will be fulfilled 100%, the consequences, in my very personal opinion, are unpredictable.
Some things I agree with Maksym. I just want to say about Yefremov. Maksym mentioned him. You can find lots of his public statements about Russia, about Luhansk People's Republic, and about that, all that kind of things. But about a month ago, he was catched, and he was like documented by photo on the mobile phone. He was met in Switzerland in the very expensive shop with alcohol, buying Dom Perignon. You know, it's a very big fan of Russia, excuse me guys, and he was blaming all the time the West, and it's one thing which is very popular among Ukrainian officials of Party of Regions and Russians also, because there are lots of people who say about the Russian world and Russian spirit, but they have all their money and their children studying in the West. A bit, you know, strange. About the supporters of Maidan, there were rumors about people getting money for the standing on Maidan. It's not true at all. But really, everyone's
It'd be too expensive to pay all of them.
but everyone contributed as they can. For example, recently in the eastern Ukraine, I met one interesting man who is now a volunteer. He's providing Ukrainian army with his support. So, and he, I mean, I began to talk to him, and he is a millionaire. And he's an owner of furniture plant, or no, not plant, but factory, furniture factory. And he was providing Maidan with a huge number of wood for people, you know, getting warm. So, and it's very, I mean, from the soups till the woods. And of course, the issue of oligarchs and their influence on Ukrainian politicians and policy, it's a huge issue. And by the way, we have to mention here Mr. Firtash, who is in Vienna, if I'm not mistaken, under the home arrest. But he is free. I mean, he goes to different discussions and say that Ukraine has involved in this conflict with Russia, and Ukraine is, we have to blame Ukraine. You know, it's very interesting because he's one of, he's a part of so-called gas lobby. And by the way, Donbass is the homeland of plenty of Ukrainian oligarchs, same as the Dnipropetrovsk region, which is the region where there was the huge number of industrial power of Ukraine and of the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union. Just to be brief, sorry. I want to say that, of course, this dependence on oligarchs and on this awful economical system should be overcome in some way. And I just see it very practically. When I come, for example, to the northern part of Luhansk, which was liberated, local people said to me, you know, nothing has changed. Those people who was collaborating with Russia to bring war on our land, they stay on the same places. Why is it so? Because this region is owned by the group of people who are called oligarchs, who are interconnected, interlinked with one another and with Firtash, Boyko, Bakulin, Dunayev, and they are still owners of basically of this land And that's why the representatives, like a Muppet Show, you know, are in the local authorities. How can it be changed if they are still owners? And I think that they have some kind of agreement with the Ukrainian government, current Ukrainian government. Okay guys, you do not touch us and we will keep the situation safe here. We will not make a destabilization. So that's a huge problem, of course. And but again, I think that it should be overcome from the grassroots. I mean, I mean to work to support and to develop the civil society, and after that to force government to change the economical structure, at least to have a chance to influence it. And of course, the huge problem for Ukraine and huge issue now, what should we do with Donbass? At least with liberated areas, because it's the area with the humanitarian catastrophe in many sense of these words.
Okay, yeah, I think we are way over time, so we probably should stop here, even though we could probably continue even longer. I'm very, very glad that you took your time to be here. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Maksym, and thank you, Tatiana. It's very interesting, and I think you really, what you were saying was very interesting to us also. So thank you very much for being here, and good luck and goodbye to the audience. Thank you.